Hey kiddos, welcome back. So today we're talking in our textbook about a section titled the exchange of ideas. I don't particularly like this term because with colonization does not come an exchange of ideas. Exchange implies equity. Under colonization, we have the taking of certain ideas and the forcing of other ideas. Not exactly an exchange or a fair trade. So in our textbook, we see lots of goods that were passed between continents. We also see ideas that were passed between continents. Again, this was not an equitable exchange. This was a forcing. So Indigenous peoples, of course, being forced to adopt European religions, European ideas of what democracy should look like. Many Native groups already had their own ideas of consensus government or democratic government. Democracy as well, while certainly in our worldview and personally we feel like it is the ideal government system, it works best when it's reached naturally. Throughout history, from Greece to the Roman Republic, to the city-states of Italy, to eventually Europe and then its colonies, democracy has come at the hands of the people. When we come into a society that is not at a crisis point where the people are rising up for power and we force this upon them, there is often resentment. Right now, we have a lot of resentment. For example, last year with the Wet'suwet'en protests, where the elected chiefs, because under Canada's Indian Act, bands are forced to elect chiefs, which again, in our worldview, I hear that and I'm like, yeah, democracy, I like democracy. But because it's been forced on a peoples, the hereditary chiefs who are from the traditional leading families still view themselves very much as leadership and having a responsibility and a personal need to protect the land. So we have two conflicting systems at play. So we had the Wet'suwet'en elected chiefs who voted to allow pipelining through. We had the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who were standing up and speaking out against it. This is what led to the protests, to the railroad shutdowns, to a huge amount of conflict just within Canada. With one Indigenous band. There are hundreds of Indigenous nations that have all been forced to adopt democracy under the Indian Act. Now, I still would agree that democracy is the best way to go, but forcing it on a peoples does not create the buy-in and the belief in democracy that we would hope, especially when we force democracy on a people and then rule them from above with an utter lack of democracy, right? That just kind of makes sense. So it sets us up for conflict. Now, in the exchange of ideas, some people talk about the benefits of colonization. Let me be very, very, very clear, my darlings. There are zero benefits to colonization, none whatsoever. Most of us are immigrants or the children of immigrants. I am. I moved to this country. When we move to Canada and we understand that we are living in the impact of a cultural genocide of the residential school system, we realize that we are somehow taking part in this colonization. And it's a very difficult realization. The same thing, if we were born here, we're feeling the after effects of being the descendants of colonizers. This is a really uncomfortable feeling for many of us. I'd say for all of us, truly. And then we have the Indigenous peoples with the intergenerational trauma that is passed down. None of this is a benefit. Colonization has no benefits. I cannot say that enough. Colonization has no benefits. So when we talk about new products and exchange of goods, yes, horses are awesome. Introducing horses to North America changed the Indigenous way of life in lots of ways for the better. They're cool animals. They carry more stuff than dogs do. But there are no benefits to colonization, because if we sat down and we did a census poll of Indigenous peoples and you say, hey, look, you got horses, you got amalgamated metals like steel, and in exchange, we perpetuated a cultural genocide on generations of your children. Cool? No, there are no benefits to colonization. I cannot say it enough. So as we go through our textbook, and you talk about the exchange of goods and the way that it changes Indigenous lives, and sometimes these things seem like positive changes. Yeah, those items are positive. The idea that they came as a result of colonization absolutely and totally puts it in a different light. So this is something I did not love about the textbook, and I felt like I needed to really clarify for us before we get into it. In terms of the ideas that the Europeans saw and really wanted to incorporate into their own government systems were the ideas of personal liberty, meaning not being under the control of a noble, that there's a lot of self-determination and self-efficacy in the indigenous lifestyle. For Europeans, most of whom as immigrants, because remember, the wealthy are not moving. The system works for them. The hierarchy does not change because of the people at the top. The people with the wealth and the power are often, almost always, not the ones saying, hey, let's shake it up and give other people some wealth and power. So the people moving to new countries are coming from your poor rural classes. Those people have been living on land owned by nobles, where their rents could fluctuate wildly, where whatever laws the nobles had in place about land distribution, about hunting various animals for food, all of this was not under their control. So these ideas of indigenous personal liberties were really appealing and were built into some of the documents like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Other things that the settlers saw was the indigenous communal land ownership, the lack of private land ownership. They saw that and they were like, that is a great idea. So we're gonna take your land and we're gonna own it, but then we'll let each other use it. Not awesome. But today, how are we seeing the effects of that worldview? Public parks, right? All of us have park space within our neighborhood. We have green spaces in the city. We have national parks. We have provincial parks. So we have all these areas that are used for the public good. We had this idea that as we start this nation, we're not going to ban anyone from these public spaces, except the people who originally owned the land, who are forced onto reservations. Another idea that really struck a note with the Europeans was the idea of consensus government, that beyond sort of elected democratic larger systems, that within our smaller systems, our villages and our towns, we could have these consensus forms of government going on, where we don't necessarily need a representative from Britain to be in charge to tell us how to run our community. So the exchange of ideas, things that were taken, were ideas of personal liberty, communal land ownership, and consensus government. Things that were forced upon the indigenous peoples were democracy on a national level, whether that is the indigenous nation or Canada as a nation, but the idea of voting for your leader was forced upon them. The lack of communal land ownership for the original inhabitants was forced upon them, and of course religion was forced upon them. So along with the exchange of goods, the exchange of ideas had far more impact on worldview. All right, we're gonna go live into Google Classroom and you're gonna answer some questions for me.